practice, I myself got really sick. I had to question everything about nutrition in order to heal myself. And that's where I discovered medicine took a wrong turn, with the idea that cholesterol causes heart attacks. And it has implications that affect every aspect of medical science, every specialty: cardiology, dermatology, orthopedics. It has implications that affect every aspect of our health, every aspect of our body. Cholesterol is a nutrient. Cholesterol doesn't cause heart attacks, but doctors believe that it does. So all of nutrition science has been fatally distorted because of this adherence to fear of cholesterol. And that's where we invite the seed oils into the conversation. So the thing that we learn as medical students is that saturated fat is bad. It raises your cholesterol. The fats that lower your cholesterol are the polyunsaturates, which are the ones in seed oils. But when I started thinking about knowing that the polyunsaturates are actually very fragile, prone to oxidizing, and when they oxidize, that's really bad. When you break a natural molecule, you turn it into an unnatural molecule that can be very toxic. But when you look at the chemistry, saturated fat is very stable, and it can even protect you perhaps from having a heart attack. So there was this disconnect, and I had to resolve that. And that was when I realized that I had been bamboozled.
So the rise in consumption of vegetable oils really is the biggest increase of consumption of any food product over the course of the 20th century. You have to understand, vegetable oils were new to America. They were not part of our diet until the early 1900s. Before that, like every Western country in the world, we cooked with butter and lard, period. And some tallow and maybe some suet, that's beef and lamb fat, but mainly lard, which comes from pigs, and butter. Then in the early 1900s, they figured out how to press oil out of seeds. It's really seed oil, it's not vegetable oil. Sunflower seeds, safflower seeds, cottonseed was the big one in the beginning. And initially this oil was used as industrial lubricants for machines. Then they discovered if they could put this oil, which was gray and smelly and disgusting, through a long process of like 15 steps, winterized, deodorized, hydrogenate, they got a product that smelled good and it looked like lard. Initially, it was developed by Procter & Gamble. They had the initial patent for this, and they thought they would use it. They were candle makers and soap makers, so they thought they would sell it as, use it for candles and soap. And somebody said, let's sell this as substitution lard. So they did. They sold it as Crisco. And they told American women, give up your lard, the smelly, smells, and old-fashioned lard, and buy this new product that we scientists have made. Then came margarine, substitute for butter. That's also hardened vegetable oil. The oil itself, they couldn't figure out how to stabilize that. So not until the 1940s did they figure out how to sell oil in bottles, like Mazola oil and Crisco oil. And those products really became the staples of American kitchens.
You know the chief killer of Americans is cardiovascular disease, disorders and degeneration of the heart and blood vessels.
Something happened after World War II, the increase in toxicity and the change of fats that we thought were healthy. Well, there was a study done by a guy named Ansel Keys, and good old Ansel meant well. It was called the 22 country study. And the whole point was let's look at these countries that have an increase in fat in their diet, specifically cholesterol and saturated fat. And we're going to see a correlation of heart disease. Well, it kind of didn't work out the way they expected. So they cherry-picked 7 countries. And the data just wasn't what it was, because the fact was the countries they let out were actually eating very high saturated fat diets like France and some others, and yet they didn't have the correlation of heart disease. Matter of fact, very low even to this day. But that turned the way our government bodies, protective bodies, looked at what fats were dangerous and what fats were healthy, right? So the shift was to these polyunsaturated fatty acids, vegetable, canola oil, soy oil. The fact is these oils are very dangerous because they turn rancid very quickly.
And when you look at the 7 country study, You do not see data tables. You do not see solid evidence linking saturated fat to heart attacks. You just see all kinds of random musings about what people in Finland who worked for the railway station used to eat for breakfast compared to what people in Japan would eat. It is not a rigorous scientific document. When the American Heart Association aligned with Procter & Gamble, that was really the beginning of a very profitable relationship that continues to this day. And ultimately, the American Heart Association got $1.75 million from Procter & Gamble, which is about $30 million in today's dollars. And that money was put to use creating what I call the mirage of evidence.
It really began in the 1950s. So President Eisenhower himself has a heart attack in 1955, is out of the Oval Office for 10 days. This is a public health emergency and there's no information. And this is a time when nobody knows what causes heart disease and everybody's in a panic. So Ancel Keys, his idea was that it was saturated fat and cholesterol. They would clog your arteries like hot grease down a cold stovepipe and give you a heart attack and die. This was called the diet heart hypothesis. Ancel Keys turned out to be this very unique individual. He was charismatic, domineering, called a bully, even by his friends. And he was very persuasive. He was the one who had persuaded Paul Dudley White, Eisenhower's doctor, to avoid fat and cholesterol was the right diet. So he was able to get his diet heart hypothesis implanted into the American Heart Association. He got on the nutrition committee there, such that the American Heart Association in 1961 issued the first advice anywhere in the entire world saying, avoid saturated fat and cholesterol in order to prevent heart disease. Ancel Keys' diet heart hypothesis grew and grew in popularity and was more and more adopted by really all the established authorities, especially the government, the National Institutes of Health. And so it just became the reigning diet for everyone. So once the American Heart Association had come out with this advice, they needed better evidence. They knew that evidence wasn't good enough. So they actually undertook a series of really ambitious randomized controlled clinical trials to see if they could prove Ancel Keys right. Ultimately, over 65,000 people were tested on his hypothesis. Does saturated fat and cholesterol cause heart disease? And in none of those experiments could they show that to be true. And that research just sort of disappeared. In reality, this huge body of evidence exists, but it's just been ignored.
I basically had to create a new body of research on how do highly polyunsaturated processed oils like soy oil and canola oil, how do they affect human physiology? What's in those bottles? What do they do to us? That took me many years. And there's 8 of them that I've defined that I've come to call the Hateful 8 now, just to help people know that there are 8. So we've got 3 C's, corn, canola, cottonseed, 3 S's, soy, sunflower, safflower, and then there's rice bran and grapeseed. And polyunsaturates will do something called oxidize, which means they will degrade. The molecules will change. So they change from something that nature made that could be good for our body to something that nature doesn't make on purpose, that our body doesn't need, that damage our lipoproteins, that turn LDL cholesterol and HDL cholesterol into little globs of toxic, inflammatory, unhealthy stuff that damages our arteries. And that's what causes plaque and heart attacks and strokes.
And then the next thing I learned about vegetable oils came from one of my sources at a top vegetable oil company, Loders and Crocklin. So this source of mine in this vegetable oil company, he says, well, now that we have these trans-free oils, they're not stable and they are oxidizing. That means they degrade into hundreds of oxidation products. And he said it's a huge problem because every fast food chain, Burger King, McDonald's, you name it, they're all using these oils. And these oxidation products turn into like a witch's brew, were his words. They get hard, like polymers, like hardened paint. And the workers were trying to scrape it off the walls. It was covering the walls. It was clogging up the drains of the fryers. The oxidation products were so unstable that When the workers took off their uniforms and they put them in the truck to go to the dry cleaners, they would spontaneously combust in the back of the truck. And this is what we're consuming. These oxidation products, they pass into the food, they pass into your body, and it turns out they seem to cause massive inflammation. You know, oxidation is happening even at room temperature. It happens with very little heat. And it happens because polyunsaturated vegetable oils. Poly refers to multiple double bonds. So every single one of those double bonds in a molecule, when it's heated just a little bit, or maybe there's a little bit of sunlight that comes into your kitchen, those double bonds open up and each of those bonds reaches out and grabs an oxygen molecule. It binds to it. Oxygen, oxidation, inflammation. That's what happens. But you know, the idea that any of these oils, canola oil or any of these oils, are safe to cook with is not true. So that's why they tell you to store oil in dark bottles, because even light will start this oxidation process.
Well, these types of fats, they go rancid very easily. And these omega-6 fats are very important in our cell membranes. So these rancid omega-6 fats that are very sensitive to heat come in and they go right where they should, into the membranes. But the problem is they're adulterated, as the scientific literature says. They're rancid. And what they do is they cause the cell membranes to inflame. They cause the cell membranes to really lose something called fluidity, which just simply means they don't function the way they should. So these bad fats are coming in and going where they should, but they're bad fats, they're adulterated. And that's why it's affecting the health of humanity. And by the way, in the mitochondria, that's where you make energy. These fats are so important in that membrane of the mitochondria, you know, our powerhouse of the cell, that they disrupt how we make energy. So now we don't think clearly, right? If we don't make enough energy in the cell, we start to lose the detox capability of the cell. And now toxins build up in the cell and bad genes start to get triggered. So this fat change was a big mistake by humanity. And unfortunately, it seems like once something gets locked into government, it just doesn't back up. Right? So fat became evil, especially saturated fat and cholesterol. And now we realize you can fry things in these saturated fats like tallow. Now, newer studies are showing that these fats are actually stabilizing to the cell membrane and even stabilizing to the hormone receptors, and they stabilize our cells in general. And they're actually really important for our health and, in fact, safe to heat, unlike these polyunsaturated seed oils.
The problem is, when you've been eating seed oils, your body fat has too many polyunsaturates. What does that mean? Basically, it's inedible to your cells. Your cells can't get energy out of it efficiently. So they burn just a little bit of your body fat, and they need to burn something else. So they go after sugar. Unfortunately, there's not enough sugar in our bloodstream, so we run out of sugar, and pretty soon, we start breaking down our muscle. You lose muscle mass. You also lose bone mass. Your body fat composition is changed. You have 5, 10, 20 times more polyunsaturates in your body fat than it can possibly use for fuel. And polyunsaturates, what do? When your cells try to burn them for fuel, they shut down the energy production. So basically, seed oils poison our metabolism, so we can no longer get energy from our body fat, and between meals, we get hungry. That's why we have an obesity epidemic. When you poison our metabolism this way, doctors will diagnose you with hypoglycemia, and they will tell you you just need to eat or snack more often. That is not the solution, because the cause is your damaged metabolism. That rewires everything about how our brain works. So we're in this state here where between meals, we are stressed, and we feel stressed unless we get sugar. So that's a recipe for a dysfunctional relationship with food. That can start happening at age 2. All the polyunsaturates from the seed oils in the food supply change breast milk composition. Children now have too much polyunsaturates in their diets. So they can't burn their own body fat normally the way babies are supposed to. This is a profound change of human physiology. We don't feel normal unless we are consuming blood sugar raising foods.
Dr. Kate Shanahan joins us now. She helps the Lakers eat better, and now she wants to do the same for you.
In 2011, I started working with the Los Angeles Lakers. And I said, okay, well, we've got to get them off the pro-inflammatory oils. They prolong recovery time. We're going to shorten recovery time. We got to get them off fueling from sugar. We got to help them fuel with their body fat. We actually ended up showing that really dramatically in a couple of cases with the Lakers, where people recovered from injuries in like a third of the time that was anticipated. So all of medical science, especially nutrition science, I think just needs a big reframe.
People don't understand that cholesterol just doesn't float around our blood. It needs carried in a little vehicle called a particle. The more particles you have, actually, the more at risk you are for driving inflammation of the arteries and therefore heart disease. But that's irrelevant to your total cholesterol, meaning you could have a 400 cholesterol and have low particles. And people go, oh, okay, yeah, you're not at risk. Or the size of the particle matters, meaning smaller particles are more damaging and drive more inflammation because they can get into the lumina of the arterial wall and drive that inflammatory process because it oxidizes. So the fact is that the particle number, more is not better, and the size. So in this case, bigger is in fact better. The bigger particles are less damaging. So we need a test called an NMR test, and that shows the particle number and the particle size, which actually matters more than your total cholesterol.
Nature makes LDL cholesterol for a reason. Nature's LDL particles have a benefit. They feed our immune system, they feed our brain, they feed all the tissues in our body that need cholesterol for their cell membranes to function normally. If we zapped the cholesterol out of all the cells in our body, we would disintegrate into a liquid pile because cholesterol helps our cell membranes stay semi-solid. It just helps them maintain their integrity. So it's absolutely vital. It's so vital, in fact, that before a cell will divide, one of the key metrics that the cell looks for is, do I have enough cholesterol? And if there's not enough cholesterol, it won't divide. I think we should get rid of the term high cholesterol and change it to normal cholesterol.
With good nutrition, everyone's a winner. So choose good nutrition for today and tomorrow.
You look at the list of funders for the American Heart Association, the American Diabetes Association, the American Dietetics Association. They're all, major food companies, ingredient manufacturers, and pharmaceutical companies. When I first started doing this research, I thought, why is Big Pharma funding nutritionists? They have nothing to do with nutrition, that's about food. But they have a clear interest in keeping people unwell. If it turns out that you can cure yourself by eating a healthy diet, you no longer need all those medications. And that, unfortunately, is a huge conflict of interest for Big Pharma. And they also benefit from nutrition experts promoting the whole LDL hypothesis, that you need to lower your LDL cholesterol by reducing saturated fats, because Big Pharma, the only thing they know how to do, they have medication for, is LDL lowering medication. They tried to make medication that would raise your HDL, your good cholesterol. They couldn't do it. So they're not interested in that heart disease risk factor, even though that one turns out to be a better predictor of heart attacks. They can't lower your triglycerides, which are driven by carbohydrate intake, so they don't have a pill for that. So they're really interested in promoting a theory that fat and saturated fat are bad for health, because that's what they have pills for.
Ask your doctor.
Ask your doctor.
Ever since pharmaceutical companies have been able to pay for ads, that drives the medical guidelines. And that's where doctors get their information. So these days, the news cycle and the medical guidelines are heavily overlapping. Statin drugs that lower our cholesterol, they were really the first blockbuster medical drug. They were released in the late 1990s. Very shortly thereafter, the pharmaceutical companies were legally now able to advertise direct to consumer on TV. And so when these drugs first come out, of course, they are not generic, they are branded. And so they can choose their profit margin. So they make billions and billions of dollars every single year. Over the years, our guidelines keep getting more and more aggressive so that more and more people qualify to take the medication. So the number of people who qualify to be on a drug has gone from less than 10% of the population to now where it's nearly 40% of the adult population. When I graduated, an LDL number of 160 was considered normal. Over the years, that LDL number has been pushed down lower and lower and lower. Now it's at 70 for people who are considered the highest risk, but they're considering pushing it down to 50 or even 30. No human being, unless they are starved, will have a cholesterol level of 30. There is no population that naturally has an LDL level of below 50, certainly not at 30. This is an experiment on the human race to push our cholesterol levels to these low levels.
The fact is it's not what people think. LDL has been demonized as the evil cholesterol, the bad cholesterol. I argue it's the most important cholesterol because it literally sits at the top of the hormone chain, meaning that we make all these hormones from LDL. So when it goes too low, we are in great danger. So it has great purpose, this cholesterol. But the problem is we have billions of dollars selling medications that lower cholesterol. If that worked, well, we would see an absolute shift in the numbers. Just thinking logically, right? Where you have, the number one killer in this country is still, in fact, heart attacks, and strokes. Wouldn't we see a shift with this miracle of statins and cholesterol-lowering medications? Well, we haven't. Why can't we shift? Why can't doctors look at these numbers? Because they're being told high cholesterol, here's the antidote. High cholesterol, here's the high LDL, here's the antidote. Right? It works real well in the system, but how's it working out for you and I, or the populace as a whole? It's not working out at all.
So our population average has dropped our cholesterol, has not stopped heart disease from being the number one killer. It's still the number one killer. The field of cardiology takes healthy people with healthy high cholesterol and turns them into patients by lowering their cholesterol, whether by telling them to eat more polyunsaturated oils that lower cholesterol, or by giving them drugs.
When I'm educating doctors or the public alike, I draw a cell. My saying is you have to fix the cell to get well. What's the first step that we have control over, okay? Because the oil that you use determines the health of that membrane. Right? It's like, so we all need an oil change and we can do it Monday. The oil changes, go back to the old way our grandmothers did. Go back to saturated fat. Don't worry about cholesterol in your diet. Seed oils, it's in everything. Here's the problem. Even when you go into a health food store and you start reading ingredients, you'll see sunflower oils, safflower oils, and most of those are rancid. Everything people are eating, every processed food, every restaurant. When we go to restaurants, we tell them we're allergic to vegetable and canola oil, because that's typically what they're using. They're rancid, adulterated fats that make their way into our membranes and affect our health hormonally, affect the way we think, affect our energy process, and that is the dangerous effect, and we're all being affected. So even when you're shopping at these stores, so one of the things I always have to teach people is how to avoid these. You have to look at the labels and be able to look for these seed oils. Now, things like avocado oil, much better, right? Now you're seeing potato chips and other things fried in tallow, which is that saturated fat that we used to fry in. This is what our grandmothers used to fry in. So we're going back to that. Even restaurants now, they're doing their fried food in tallow. Restaurants don't make a shift, do they? Until enough people come in and say, we want pure olive oil, right? And by the way, when you go to Europe, it's a very different story. They are not using these oils like we are in the United States. And these oils are absolutely devastating our health. Any better restaurant will say, okay, yeah, we can make that in pure olive oil, or we can make that in pure butter, right? So they'll make a transition. Butter is a very stable, saturated fat. It doesn't take heat as well as lard, but it's still much better. If you're going out to eat, there's so many places that will do it correctly for you or already do it correctly. So we're seeing a shift, but the average person doesn't know.
I am Chef Mark Tarbell. I live in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm just a hospitality guy. I'm a chef. I love wine and spirits and cocktails, and really I just like to bring joy to people. I have restaurants, a catering company, and a wine company. We do not use any seed or vegetable oil or any processed oil. With seed oils, I jumped right into the knowledge and study of it and found that there's really a lot of things that made sense to me as a chef. I just stopped eating them, I felt better, and I always use my body as the vessel for testing, and I want people to feel good when they leave. I'm just an observational person, I'm a practical, simple person. I started looking at the fryer we were using and how hard it was to get that varnish that was stuck on the back of the fryer, which was residual from frying. And then if a pan was, you were using canola oil or something, it would drip over the pan. We could barely scrub it off. And I'm like, okay, that's not good. But I'm like, well, that has to do something because it's not liquefying in an easy way in my body. And when you use something like coconut oil or avocado oil or olive oil or tallow, it's slippery. You know, it just comes right off. You can wash it. So, you know, for me, I use tallow, I use pork lard, I use schmaltz, which I love. We make a lot of stuff with schmaltz. We render our own schmaltz from chicken fat. And we use duck fat. We use coconut oil for all of our vegan and vegetarian people. We have a separate fryer for that. And mostly olive oil. I would say 80% all of our sauces and cooking and frying is all in olive oil. It's expensive, but I love olive oil. I've always loved the flavor, texture, and feel of it. It's really harder for me now because I really have to understand why I'm going seed-free. I have to read a lot, I have to study a lot, talk to experts and doctors. I felt it was important for me to do it as a responsible restaurateur and chef, but now it's becoming more a thing. You know, really it's becoming something you can put out in front and say, I am this, or I am that, or I am seed oil free. Communities are now really demanding it, so commerce comes into play. If you're not seed oil free, then maybe you'll do less business, you know. But I think getting the message out there in a way that's not political or threatening, because I think health is not political. I think health is health. And I think no matter where you stand, you should be for health.
So True Food Kitchen is the largest full-service, farm-to-table restaurant in the country. It was a few months after our investment that the company officially stopped cooking with seed oils. And transforming a restaurant from using cheap synthetic ingredients like seed oils to moving away from it is difficult because we still had a few ingredients that still had seed oils. And we had to do a 2-year audit to figure out where the remaining seed oils were. And you would be shocked at how difficult initially this is. We could not find a supplier that didn't have seed oil-free mayonnaise, so we had to make our own mayonnaise. We found things like dried cranberries. A lot of dried fruit is actually coated in seed oils because they want to prevent them from sticking to each other. So we looked around, we could not find dried cranberries that didn't have sunflower seed oil on it. So we actually had to get rid of them. And I will tell you categorically that in the short term, it is profit and margin reducing. It requires a very mission-driven, intentional leadership team to say, I'm doing this for society. I'm doing this for my kids. I'm doing this to make a statement. Unfortunately, in my experience as a businessman, there's not a lot of people that do that because it's really hard. It goes against how our society functions. And our society, as of American society, much more so than European, revolves around pure capitalism.